By 1922-1923, Trotsky was incredibly unhappy with the economic and political settlement of the new economic policy. In economics, Trotsky was warning that the economy was gearing itself to the re-emergence of kulaks, of capitalist peasants. And he argued, given that the Soviet Russia is still predominantly an agricultural nation, if capitalism wins in the countryside, then it is going to overtake the country. The revolution is going to fail. So he's arguing that what Bolshevism needs to do is to take resources away from this emerging kulak class and to use those resources for the development of planned heavy industry. This is the area out of which socialism is going to emerge for Trotsky. This is where the advanced working class comes from. This is where you get the economic base to defeat capitalism from and imperialism from. And he says, why are we failing to develop this type of socialist strategy in these new conditions? He argues it's because the political regime within the party has become bureaucratized. The party is being controlled, he argues, by bureaucrats from within the General Secretariatship. Stalin had been made General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. Trotsky said this was an incredibly unhealthy regime within the party, that it had completely extinguished democracy within the party, so that Stalin was merely using the General Secretariatship to appoint his own people throughout the party. Debate within the Central Committee and the Politburo, Trotsky argued, had come to a complete halt. On the contrary, an inner circle had formed that used to meet before a full session of the Politburo, the Central Committee, reach its decisions on all the important issues, so when Trotsky went along, everything was predetermined. It was pointless to have any type of discussion or any type of debate, because the bureaucrats of the Stalin circle were already in control. And this is why, when Trotsky would go along to these full meetings of the Politburo and the Central Committee, he would sit there with a look of haughty indifference. And he would read French novels. Now, this may have been his reasoned intellectual response, but it is no way to act politically. It is no way to build alliances. That his colleagues looked upon him and said, Trotsky is arrogant. He has a look of haughty indifference. See how he behaves when we gather as a collective. Trotsky's political response was to argue for democratization of the Communist Party. He said, we must have multi-candidate elections for office holders within the party, and these people have to be elected by the ordinary membership. We have to reassert workers' control over the party. Now, there were two major problems with Trotsky's strategy. One was he had no way of reaching ordinary workers. Now, this was largely because of a self-imposed limitation on his own politics. Trotsky argued at party conferences that one could not be right against the party because the party was the only historical instrument that had been created for the victory of the revolution. So he followed the logic of the ban on factions. By refusing to take his campaign outside the elite bodies, outside of letters to the Central Committee, he placed a fatal limitation on his own politics. The other reason that Trotsky's strategy was not going to lead anywhere is because it was rejected by the Politburo and the Central Committee. They argued that Trotsky was exaggerating the level of capitalism within the Soviet countryside. He was overstating the extent to which a kulak class was emerging. He was also ignoring the way that the Soviet economy was recovering through the new economic policy. So that by 1924, for example, pre-war levels of production had once again been achieved within this economy, and that was down to the new economic policy. They argued that if Trotsky was overemphasizing, overstating economic dangers, he also had a completely incorrect view of the political regime within the Bolshevik Party. They argued that Trotsky was somebody that they tried continually to draw within party work, but it was Trotsky himself who rejected the overtures from the party. That Trotsky himself was politically isolated because of his own arrogance, because of his own individualism. That Trotsky, they reckoned, was somebody who had always, in a sense, not found it easy to subordinate himself to the discipline of the party. By 1924, Lenin died. He'd really been effectively excluded from high-level politics from 1922 onwards. His final political writings and his political testament are nevertheless incredibly interesting documents. They're interesting documents because they do not highlight Trotsky as Lenin's natural successor. Lenin has as many criticisms of Trotsky as he does of other members of the leading Bolshevik group. So Trotsky could draw no solace, no comfort from Lenin's last writings in terms of any obvious Lenin backing for Trotsky as the post-Lenin leader. When Lenin died, Trotsky was en route to the south, to the resorts of the Black Sea for convalescence. Trotsky told a particular story about Lenin's funeral in his autobiography and in his subsequent biography of Stalin. And the line Trotsky took was, he was absent from Lenin's funeral because Stalin lied to him about the date of Lenin's funeral. In this way, he was prevented from returning to the capital, and Stalin made most political capital out of presenting himself as the great Leninist at Lenin's funeral. This was not the case. After Lenin died, there was an emergency meeting of the Central Committee. This is understandable. This meeting decided various issues around the funeral of Lenin. As soon as the meeting had decided that Saturday was going to be the date of Lenin's funeral, Stalin sent an emergency telegram to Trotsky, informing him that the funeral would be held in 4 days' time. Trotsky received this telegram that told him this information, and he knew at the point of receiving it that he had 3 days to get back to Moscow. And I think this is why Stalin acted so quickly. He acted so quickly so Trotsky could return to the capital. And having just made the journey from Moscow to the Tiflis railway station that he was, Trotsky knew it would take 3 days for that journey. But Trotsky invents another telegram. He says, I received a telegram from Stalin, and I telegrammed the Kremlin to say, have I enough time to return to Moscow for the funeral? They telegrammed back to say, no, you haven't. You might as well continue on with your journey. Only subsequently, Trotsky claims, did I discover that I would have had enough time to return. Well, we have the original telegram. We know that Trotsky knew from that first telegram that he could have returned in time. So there was no need for him to telegram the Kremlin again. Indeed, no subsequent correspondence has ever been discovered either in the Moscow archives, nor, crucially, in the Trotsky archives at Harvard University that Trotsky took with him from the 1920s. Had such a correspondence existed, then surely Trotsky would have published it. Surely he would have made reference to it. So, why didn't Trotsky go back to Moscow for Lenin's funeral? The answer for me is that it is a sign of Trotsky's political isolation by the January of 1924. He knew he could have returned, but he couldn't bear the thought of returning. He couldn't bear the thought of marking Lenin's death alongside Stalin and all the other people from whom he was already politically divided. It is a sign of Trotsky's isolation, a sign of his powerlessness in the corridors of power, that he himself decided no, I'm not going to return to Moscow, I'm going to continue on with my convalescence and feel sorry for myself on the Black Sea coast. So nothing is more certain for me, already from about 1922, that Trotsky was going to fall from power once Lenin died. Yes, he served tremendous efforts for the Soviet government, both as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, as head of the Red Army, as a developer of propaganda, of certain strategies for the development of the revolution, but politically he was naive, incompetent, a bungler. It was because of his isolation that Trotsky fell from power very quickly after Lenin's death.